do so, we got plenty of room up here so you could hear better and then interact with the speaker a little bit better, okay?
For this morning session, we will go on the topic of disease and disease control by Dr. Lee, the Associate Professor, Extension Turf Grass Pathologist from University of Missouri. His research will focus on the disease control, and he spent his time to responsibility to provide the disease diagnosis and control recommendation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Lee Miller.
Thank you very much. First off, let me start off by saying how much of an honor it has been to come here and to visit your culture and to experience your culture. This is my first time in Thailand, and I will say you have a beautiful country. It's called the Land of Smiles, and I understand why. Your hospitality has been amazing and gracious, and I've learned a lot from you. And I hope that I'm able to give back just a little bit back to you, and hopefully you can give it and use it in your management and improve your golf courses. So I'm going to get started and kind of introduce myself a little bit and about where I'm from or where I live now. Columbia, Missouri is in between St. Louis, Missouri and Kansas City, Missouri, right in the middle of the state. And pretty much I like the music to get me started. And pretty much if you throw a dart at the United States, we're right in the middle. We're in a very interesting and difficult area of the world to live in. We're called the transition zone of the United States. So what that means is that we're really hot in the summer. We get up to 35 degrees Celsius and higher. And we get really cold in the winter. So our grasses will go dormant. We're 0 to -10, sometimes to -20 degrees Celsius. So my joke is, and really it is a statement of fact, is that we can grow any grass we want to in Missouri. We just can't grow any of them very well. So it's because of that climatic differences. Now, when we look at where that area is within this Asia type of region, we are north of Tokyo, at least in our parallels. So I think Kano might be one that you might be familiar with, Andrew. But also we would pretty much go through North Korea and Pyeongchang, and of course there's some elevation differences, so we'll have some climate differences there. And then on our northern edge of where Missouri would be, is where Beijing, China would be. So just to give you an idea of the type of grasses that we manage in our state and in our region compared to kind of where it is. And obviously Thailand is much south of that, so we're going to have much different grass species here than we have in Missouri. And we actually don't have ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens. So this is kind of where we're seeing the range of Bermuda grass greens go up into the United States. And you can see our line, we are almost to Bermuda grass greens here in Missouri. But here we are in northern Arkansas, Paducah, Kentucky, and you can see all of this range is pretty much where ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens have taken over bent grass greens. We have a few folks that are thinking about the transition to ultra-dwarfs. But we had a very, very cold winter a couple years ago in 2014, and that kind of shut that down. So I'm going to be talking mostly about diseases. I know that weed control was on the agenda too. I'm not a weed scientist. I would leave that up to Dr. Brosnan, who's been here before, and other weed scientists. I think someone had a question earlier about how to take weeds out of zoysia. That's something that I definitely would go to someone else to look for that expertise. But I am going to talk about, and my job, and I've had to explain this to my mother, is that I am a coroner for grass, the legal kind, turf grass. So I tell folks why their grass died, and I tell them how to fix it. And I do research so I don't have to be a coroner so often. So when I go through and we have a diagnostic lab, and that lab, we normally get somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 samples a year, so it's not one of the bigger labs in the United States. But about 50% of the time, when we get a sample in, we have no disease that's involved. So that is caused by abiotic things. This is obviously all biotic or living causes, so we can have diseases, which is what I'll be talking about, insects, weeds, or nematodes. But our other common turfgrass problems, and what we see most often that comes into our lab, is abiotic problems, or those caused by non-living. So things like chemical burn, fertilizer and pesticides, compaction, pH extremes. But these are often very closely tied together. So when you have a problem with your plant, and your plant is not healthy, for the most part, you're going to be more susceptible to a disease or to another problem. So particularly when we go out and maybe we spent a little bit too much time on Pattaya and Walking Street last night, and you might have a little bit of a headache. The reason you have a headache and you might actually get sick afterwards is because you predisposed yourself with one of these abiotic issues. So that often can lead to disease. So we often say that a healthy plant is a resistant plant, and it's one that's going to stand up against disease, crowd out weeds, and be more tolerant of insect pests. So a number of different abiotic disorders, chemical burn, soil, what's going on in the soil, compaction and pH. Salt damage is a big one, particularly if higher rates of fertilizer, and if you're not able, particularly in the dry season here, to get those salts out of your greens and to leach those out. They can accumulate and cause burn in the plant. Mechanical injury, if you scalp or mow too low. The environment, which you have, I know you don't have much difference in temperature, but you have a very big difference in your rainy season, which I hear is coming in May. So you can have problems with too much water, and you can have problems with not enough water. And then last but not least, genetic variability and how that might, how the host plant might play a role in what that disease or what that environment will do to it. So the problem comes in diagnosis. And I know that you don't have a number in the United States. We have a number of different turfgrass diagnostic labs to go to. And I know that that is a limited resource here in Asia. The problem comes is that a lot of these things, if you're looking at my height, and I'm sorry I don't know what my height is in meters, but if you just look at them from a distance, they look very similar. And if you misdiagnose a problem, you're going to basically be a dog chasing after its tail, and you're never going to catch it. Because if you're chasing that wrong problem, you're putting money and resources and time into going after the wrong thing. So one of these, and I'm going to get you a little bit involved here. We're going to have a little crowd participation. I have prizes for you. So, and please give everyone a chance for the interpreter to tell them what I'm saying. But which one of these 3 pictures here, and just raise your hand, is not a disease? Come on, I'm giving away a prize. Micah, no, you can't answer. In the back? Do we have a microphone, by the way? Can we get a microphone out in the crowd real quick? Anybody? Come on, it's a very good prize, I'm telling you. Which one, you or you? Who raised your hand first? All right, we'll go with you. Which one is not a disease? Top right. So this one? Why did you say that? First of all, you're right.
Hello. It's like a weather effect.
Yeah, it's actually a chemical application.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you'll notice, Andrew, can you hand this to him? What you see here is that this is a misapplication of a herbicide, an over-application, so a bad rate. And notice here that this is kind of in a straight line. Notice how you can kind of see that pattern. So that's one thing that you're going to want to look for when you're looking to decide whether or not you have disease activity or not. So here in this, you can kind of see where you have patches or areas that look, there's not a clear, sharp line that's going on there. And then here, this is spring dead spot, by the way, on Bermuda grass. And this is large patch on, now, this is kind of a trick one, and I'm glad that you got around it, because we actually have applications here. This is a research plot. But you can see that it's a little bit more scalloped or patchy as opposed to straight lines. So that's something that you need to be able to recognize. So when we look at plant diseases, and actually you can use this with any plant pest that you really want, there's this interaction, and we call this the disease triangle. So for a disease or a pest problem to occur, you need to have the pathogen, the thing that is causing the disease. Most of the time for us, that's fungi. You need a susceptible host, preferably one that's been out on Walking Street all night and is a little bit stressed out. And then lastly, you need the conducive environment. So you need those environmental conditions that will bring about that disease, perhaps stress out the turf grass and make the disease occur. When we look at diagnosis, though, we can look at that triangle and we can kind of place things on what kind of factors we need to look at. So when we're looking at the environment, we're looking at our climate, recent weather. Are we in our monsoon season or our rainy season? Or are we in a drought season? Are there signs of the pathogen? And that's what we look for. So one thing I would suggest is that if you think that you have a disease, do what we do. We incubate, so either in a plastic bag or in a Tupperware container. We'll take a cup cutter plug and we'll slice it, and then we'll put a wet paper towel and just put it in that Tupperware container so that you increase the humidity. And then you can see if you have something like this, where you have the mycelium come out of it. And that is a sign of that pathogen that's there. And that's one way, particularly if you don't have access to a diagnostic lab, that you can try at least to get an idea if you're having disease activity. And then last but not least, look at the plant and stand symptoms. So I gave you, what I'm giving away are basically these not very expensive jeweler's loupes. So a little bit of a magnifying glass. They're only about 10x, and they do two things. One, they will help you to look at the smaller symptoms that you can't see with your eye. So you're looking for leaf spots and other things that are on the plant, particularly on golf greens, very small plants. So pick them out and you can look at the roots and also the leaf symptoms. And then also use it in front of your boss. So I like to wear it around my neck, and it makes you look really good in front of your boss when you're looking through one of these. So, sorry. He's on to your secret. So, obviously you want to get a little bit closer than this. If you remember, this is Camilo Villegas, and this was how he would read greens. But you need to get up close and personal and really look at that plant. And look for symptoms that look like spots, or if you can, rinse out the roots and look for darkened roots that will give you an idea whether or not you have a fungal disease that's in play. So, what you're often looking for is something like this. This is large patch on zoysia grass. So you can see that down on that sheath is where that infection point is. And again, you would be using about the best you're going to be able to do is to get to a magnifying glass like that. Whereas if you, in a diagnostic lab, we would bring that back in and look under a microscope, looking at 400 times magnification, so that we can actually look for the individual structures of that fungus to try and accurately diagnose what that disease might be. Now remember, I'm saying all this, but about 50% of the time, you don't have a disease at play. So those are often the hardest ones to diagnose, because when we get things in, we just dig and dig and dig and dig. And then finally you got to go, well, there's no pathogen here, there's no disease that's causing these symptoms. You never know who will be looking at a microscope. So this is the Missouri tiger. We did this for kids. But this is kind of an illustration that, particularly if you do, I don't want everybody to run out and try and buy a microscope, because you really need to have a good amount of training to try and look for each one of these things. But if you use at least the magnifying glass, you can go and look for some of these symptoms that can perhaps clue you off that you might need to do some kind of management practice. So distinguishing diseases from other problems, remember diseases progress. So they're not static. If you were to go and make a herbicide application on accident, you wouldn't see that really moving that much. Whereas diseases will grow. So if you see things that look to be getting worse and worse and worse over time, some will actually go out and mark edges of where they see things. So if you can mark it and still keep out of play, then you can see where those diseases, and that basically most of the time it's a fungus that just is keeping moving away and farther away from that source. You have a gradual change for the most part between healthy and dead turf. So you don't have that real sharp demarcation line that you would get from some other kind of non-living problem. Again, diseases do not occur in straight lines. That is a very, very important point. For the most part, they are scalloped. They are randomly aggregated throughout the turfgrass stand. Most of the time, they will not kill large areas and then leave adjacent turf untouched. There are a couple exceptions to that, but for the most part, they're not just going to take out an area, make it completely brown, and then everything within that area is damaged. And then last, but certainly not least, if you have a mixed stand of turfgrass, so more than one species, it normally will only affect one of those. So I often say the best Bermuda grass conversion process from zoysia grass to Bermuda is large patch. Now I know you don't have a lot of large patch here in Thailand, but as you go up, particularly where you have some cooler climates, then large patch can be an issue. Also, it's a good way to get in. You'll often see weeds that will be there and take out that one species that you're trying to manage. So next question. What do you think this is? Biotic or abiotic? Or I should say, do you think this is a disease or not? Come on, I got a shiny magnifying glass for you. Take a shot. It's 50-50. No one? All right, I'm keeping this one. This actually is bug spray. So this is a golfer that was standing. You can see where his footprints were, and he was standing and spraying his legs, and the bug spray went onto the turf grass and burned it. How about this one? Yes. Yeah, so this is, you're right. Micah, can you hand this to him? So this is actually in America, because at least where I'm at, it snows, and we use salt to melt the ice, and this is salt damage from the runoff that went out. So this is not a disease. How about this one? What's that? Disease or not disease? Not disease, all right. Why did you? So not a disease, because what actually is going on here are these trees. It's kind of hard to see here, but it's scalloped like this, and these trees that are on this side are actually taking the water away. So that actually is drought symptoms from competition of the trees. This one is way too easy. You've probably seen this before, so I'm not giving anything away. This is the straight line thing, right? So this is fertilizer misapplication. They were using a drop spreader, and they did not mark where they went very well. So they went a little bit too far. And then last but not least, disease or not disease? What? I'm not giving you one, Mati. Trick question. This is Bermuda grass. This is zoysia grass. So the large patch is impacting the zoysia grass, which is more susceptible, and then the Bermuda grass strips are not affected. So this is a disease because it's hitting one turf grass preferentially than the other one. Okay, so getting into that, let's talk about the host a little bit and talk about this first part of the triangle. And one of the first things that we can do to manage turfgrass diseases is to put the right host down or to use the right turfgrass species or cultivar to begin with. So if you don't, it's kind of like putting the truck in before you try to launch the boat. It's very difficult if you're starting with a plant that is not in the right place to start with, then it's never going to be the right plant in the wrong place. So make sure that you spend a lot of time, particularly there's a lot of construction here in Thailand, make sure that you spend some time getting to know the plants that you're going to, and the turfgrass species that you're going to establish. So we have two choices. We either have warm season turf grasses, which is what we would be using here in Thailand, obviously, or we have cool season if you get up into Korea and Japan. Obviously here in Thailand, we would not even be thinking about cool season. So Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, and seashore paspalum are the main choices, and I've seen some of both. When we look at warm season, really it's all tied to temperature. So your best root growth is 24 to 29 degrees C. And then green up occurs if you do have colder temperatures at 13 degrees C, and then your best shoot growth is 27 to 35 degrees C and up. Although Mike and I have talked about it, and maybe that is even preferential between different warm season species within this warm season grasses. In reality, at least here in Thailand, the way that I feel it now, with the heat and humidity, it's pretty much when you have your temperatures that are into this optimal range, you obviously do not have that kind of camel, and you pretty much have at least our summer temperatures all year long. And just looking at the historical averages, you can see that you pretty much flatline right around 29, 30 degrees Celsius for your high temperatures, and your minimum temperatures might move a little bit, but you really don't have the seasons. So therefore, warm season grasses are a very good choice. When we look at the different, you go into Dr. Beard's book and Turgeon's book in particular, and you look at the different advantages to these particular species, you can see that there are some differences. So for the most part, seashore paspalum likes wet feet. So it would grow best in waterlogged conditions. Whereas if you get into, and of course many of the cultivars vary, but I would put Bermuda grass in the middle and zoysia grass as being the poorest at being waterlogged. If you're in drought conditions, it completely flips. So particularly in the dry season here in Thailand, you probably will have a hard time. You're going to need to put more inputs for water for seashore paspalum than you would for the other two species. Shade tolerance, no grasses like shade. none of them. But of them, seashore and zoysia is probably two of the better choices if you do have large trees around your greens, or if you have large trees, particularly around the collar areas or things like that. A lot of shade issues. Particularly ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass does not do good in shade. Really poor performance. When we look at dollar spot susceptibility, so now we're getting into this disease realm. Of these warm season grasses that we really know that dollar spot is much more severe on seashore paspalum. We can also see it on zoysia, but we don't see it that often. And we can also see it on Bermuda grass. But for the most part, we can fertilize out of dollar spot that's on zoysia grass or Bermuda grass, whereas seashore paspalum actually might need a fungicide input. So we have a number of what we call our NTEP trials. So these are cultivar trials that we do in the United States. So we've got all these different turfgrass species. Like I said, I live in the transition zone. So with our weather conditions, we can evaluate about anything, and we're really tough on everything. So this is one thing you can look at for some cultivars. Now, I've come here and I've toured around, and the varieties that you grow of these different species are completely different, and I've never heard of them or seen them before. So it's been a very, very good learning experience for me to see things like Novatech and Salam and some of these other cultivars that I don't have any experience with. So that's where you really need to rely on your local knowledge. This is what ours look like in Missouri. This is our warm season Bermuda grass trial. You can see we put them in squares and separate them so they don't grow into each other. But we do have our winter. I talked about we had a very cold winter in 2013. We actually had winter kill or complete winter loss in 27 out of 35 of our Bermuda grass varieties, and 33 out of 35 of our zoysia grass varieties died in the first year of planting. And if you want to see, that was a pretty big tear that came to my face, because that means we had to go back and replant all those again, which was quite a bit of work. But that's, at least where I live, that kind of winter injury can occur. If you want to go to see our trials or any of the trials that are throughout the United States, the website is ntep.org, www.ntep.org. It's not the easiest thing to navigate. I'll go ahead and warn you of that. But if you do want to see some of the cultivars that we look at on a regular basis, you can find them there. You also have this guy, Micah in the front row, who has looked at some of these varieties and has a good handle on them. And I don't know if you still have this up or not, but at least there are some kind of trials going on. All right, so moving and shifting that triangle again, we're going to talk about the environment, because we don't want to apply fungicides. We don't want to spend that money if we don't have to. And the other aspect is we talk about disease management and pest management. We can't just do one thing. We can't just pick up a pesticide and spray it and think that it's going to cure all of our ills. We need to be doing many different things. A lot of those revolve around creating a healthy plant, but we need to do a lot of things to try and manage pest outbreaks. And it can't just be what's on the shelf and what can I put in a sprayer. So when we think of that, we need to think about the biology of what that pest or what that pathogen is, and we need to think about what it needs. So what is the pathogen, what does the fungus need to survive and cause disease? And the first one of those that is big is water. All of these fungi need water in some way, particular foliar diseases need a period of leaf wetness. They need temperature, which you're not really going to modify temperature very much here. But they need, if you do have any seasonal changes in temperature, they need that temperature. And then last, they need a host that is susceptible and preferably a little bit stressed out. So I'll talk a little bit about mowing. There's really pretty standard as far as when we think about mowing. You know, it's the periodic defoliation. It's what we put most of our labor towards. And mowing, we often think of as being kind of it's going to injure the plant. But it is very, very important, obviously, for us, for aesthetics and for being able to provide playing conditions for the golfer, good ball roll. But there also is an aspect of weed control, an aspect of rodent control, and snakes don't like to be in short grass very much. And then also it can have a positive effect on the density of the plant, particularly if you're mowing it to its adapted height. You know, when we talk about, this is the only weed part I'm gonna put in here, but for the most part we're pretty standard as far as our mowing of warm season grasses. But when it comes to my region of the country, where we're dealing with cool season grasses, mowing to its adapted height can actually reduce our weed pressure. So for us, our lawns are mostly tall fescue, so we would mow those at 3.5 or 4 inches and actually have an 80% reduction in crabgrass. Also, you've got to realize that when you're mowing and you're taking heights down, you're also injuring the plant more. So we talked about when you're getting ready for a tournament, that you're going from 2.8 millimeters and you're stepping it down to get to something else, or 3 millimeters down to 2.5 millimeters. When you're doing that, your inputs are going up because you are injuring that plant more and you're predisposing it to more stress. Use and like Dr. Kreuzer said on Monday, using Primo to try and limit that growth so you're not actually injuring and getting into the crown of the plant is very important. So disadvantages, often you need to think about, if I'm taking the mowing height down, that for the most part you're also taking roots as well. It's not a one-to-one type of thing, but think about that. You need to be thinking about your roots at all times and what's going on in the soil. You're going to have less photosynthesis. Obviously, you're robbing the plant of its ability to take in food. If I don't eat, I get cranky. And the same thing happens when we're talking about turf grass and lowering that mowing height. It also, we need to think about mowing as being, we can injure the plant, and you're actually causing wounds that the pathogens can get in. I'm very happy that Dr. Bill talked about the mowing rule and that the third rule still applies. Thank you, because I had this in here. I wasn't sure if I was going to have to change it or not. But for the most part, that third rule is a good rule of thumb, particularly on some of our roughs and things of that nature. You obviously don't want to clump. You don't want to leave grass clippings on top of the turf because that is a perfect environment for diseases underneath. So whenever you can, try and remove grass clippings because that can breed disease underneath. Also, it's very important for mower maintenance. Make sure you're keeping the mower blade sharp and that you're getting a good clean cut. The reason for that is very simple. Wherever you cut a plant is a very good entry point for a disease to get in, particularly a foliar disease, obviously only a foliar disease. So things like leaf spot. And the shortest distance to make it between 2 points is a straight line. And that is what a clean cut is a straight line. So if you're ripping and shearing the turf grass, then you're gonna lead to more disease issues. So when we're talking about, again, I just want to reiterate that we're talking about integrated disease management. It's not just picking one tool. So it's also picking a number of different tools to try and manage diseases effectively. We often think of fungicides not being, when we think of this integrated disease management, we don't want fungicides to be part of this, but they are a tool that we can use, and I'm going to talk about how to hopefully more effectively use those later on, more towards lunch. But particularly the first one of those that I want to talk about is moisture. And water is really a key aspect. So you can either have not enough drainage or too much water that's in the soil. So that is closely linked to soil-borne diseases. So Pythium root rot is one that likes a very wet, almost like a swimming pool for a golf course green. Large patch, another one that you don't have a whole lot of, but this is actually large patch that is in lower areas. Bermuda grass decline, which I'll talk about a little bit more towards lunch, is one that also likes a very wet environment. So the more that you can limit the water in your soil and try to keep things a little bit more on the dry side, the more that you will limit some of these very damaging soil-borne diseases. And then, secondly, not just within the soil, but also on the plant. So we kind of use these. We need about 9 hours of leaf wetness for like brown patch to occur or dollar spot, and we need about 13 hours of leaf wetness for Pythium blight. So those are kind of our standard kind of rules that we use for the amount of leaf wetness. So anything you can do to try and get that leaf wetness or get that water off the canopy is very, very important. And in particular, one of the major ways that happens every night is through dew. So trying to remove dew and getacean fluid. So look at these pictures, and what do all these pictures have in common? Basically all these pictures. So here we've got irrigation, so that one might not make sense. But here we've got mowing, rolling. We've got removing pruning limbs here. This is a fan. And then lastly, this one should be a really good hint. This is called a dew whip. But basically this is all ways of removing dew and leaf wetness. So doing these practices will limit, particularly if you have problems with dollar spot on seashore paspalum or any other of these foliar diseases, then this can be one way to try and minimize the severity of those diseases. So again, mowing in the morning, you can see here that you're removing that dew. And then irrigation is the one that seems to be a little bit tricky. So if you water at dusk, so basically at 7 or 8 p.m., and basically you are starting the leaf wetness event. You have dew that will naturally set on many nights at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., and you're waiting until it burns off the next morning or until you mow it off. But if you time your irrigation backwards, so you do your irrigation at dawn, that basically you rinse off all of that dew and getacean fluid, and you can actually impact the disease. You can actually impact and kind of rinse it down. So it's very important to try and time your irrigation from, and I know that there might be a number of different zones, and I know that you might have a lot of time that you need to run your irrigation at night. But if you can think of running it from dawn backwards, you can try and use this irrigation to try and minimize that leaf wetness duration. Fertilization is another aspect. So this is obviously cool season, which we're not going to worry about, but you want to be fertilizing grasses when they're actively growing. Here in Thailand, it's growing all the time. There's a lot of temperature. The only thing that might limit it might be sunlight when we get into the rainy season. Now, I'm a little confused on how that might actually all work out with growth potential, because you might not have a lot of light, but you're also having a lot of water that is rinsing all those nutrients out. So that's, I'm sure for you, that's a very interesting time to balance out those nutrients. But when we look at, in particularly, that impact of nitrogen fertilization on turfgrass disease, we kind of have this balance that occurs. So we have some diseases, like on your left, my right, that are low nitrogen diseases. They like a plant that is a little bit stressed out with not a lot of nitrogen. On the other side are your high nitrogen diseases. What I want to point out here is that large patch, you notice that one is crossed out. That is not impacted by nitrogen. So, and again, not many of you deal with that one. But one of the other ones I want you to look at is in particular seashore paspalum, dollar spot. Also, if you get dollar spot on zoysia grass or Bermuda grass, that often is kind of a clue that perhaps you need to put a little bit more nitrogen down because it's on that low nitrogen side. So when you look at this is actually 2 plots, and the only difference here is this has had a lot of urea, and this one has been under-fertilized on this side. And you've got dollar spot on this side, and you've got brown patch on this side. Again, the reality here, when we're talking about it, this is our, we have a very flat growth pattern here, so you need to be keeping up with your fertilization, particularly I would say for seashore paspalum and for dollar spot control, to try and stay on top and fertilize that plant to where it needs to be. When we look also, though, at some of the research on how much to fertilize, there's a couple, McCullough and particularly McCarty and Canigallo, wrote an article in 2005 looking at what this nitrogen rate is. So 0.14 to 0.18 kilograms per 100 meters squared during the summer. Grasses, grown on sand-based root zone with heavy rainfall or an extended growing season may require the higher rate. I believe that's you here in Thailand about that higher rate. So what does that mean for subtropics or this with consistently warm temperatures? That's what basically this higher type of rate would be per year. Now, we also have other developed, more recently developed models that Micah has put together along with Pace Labs. And if you go to, you can find this, and we look at this growth potential model used by the Asian Turfgrass Center, developed by them and Pace and Larry Stoll. They provide this really cool equation, which you don't really want to mess with, which I don't want to mess with, but they give you an Excel spreadsheet, which is very nice. So I was able to go and kind of compare what we would see in Missouri versus what you would see here in Thailand. And again, this isn't, I don't, and Mikey, you can yell at me later for saying this wrong. I don't think this is something that you would actually go and look at and say, okay, this is the pure amount of nitrogen that I'm going to put out on ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens and teas and roughs, but it should give you an idea at least of what the differences are. And for me, when I look at the Bangkok monthly temperature and I see it flatlining, when you look at the nitrogen rates that are put out by this growth potential model, they also flatline at the same kind of rates. So putting that kind of information together at least can give you a guide, and along with your experience, of how much nitrogen perhaps you should be putting down. The other aspect that's important about nitrogen, and Bill's talk was a great segue into mine because we're talking so much about nitrogen fertilization. But we also have this great part about nitrogen, and it's the only nutrient that can be taken up this way, is that it can be taken up by a cation and an anion. So it can either be taken up as a nitrate, which has a negative charge, or it can be taken up as ammonium, which is a positive charge. And that can have a lot of influence, particularly on our soil-borne diseases. And the reason for that is the influence that you can have on the pH of the soil. So this is a very interesting story, and I think when we get into particularly talking about Bermuda grass decline, which we're not sure is happening in a large amount here, but it is something to be concerned about. We're seeing it in the United States quite a bit on some of our older ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens. But what the story is here is that when you put an ammonium-based fertilizer down, like ammonium sulfate, you are correspondingly reducing the pH of your soil, or that area in particular that's right around the root. Because what has to happen is the root has to kick out a hydrogen ion to take up that ammonium. And by doing so, it makes that area around the root acidic. On the flip side of that, if you put calcium nitrate down or a nitrate form, you do the exact opposite. So what you make is an alkaline pH. And this can have a very big impact on some of our soil-borne diseases. We've studied this quite a bit in our cool season, so bent grasses. But I think we need to look at it much more when we get into our Bermuda grass and our ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass, particularly, again, with that decline. So I talked about that teeter-totter with the nitrogen for foliar, but we also could potentially have this teeter-totter going on for our soil-borne diseases. So we know that our nitrate forms, which make a more, again, alkaline pH, will increase our take-all patch and summer patch. We're not sure about spring dead spot. We think there are some differences there between species and also between soil types. But then we're also, particularly where I was talking about Bermuda grass decline, that particular pathogen is very closely related to take-all patch. In fact, it's the same genus and species. It's just a little bit different. So can we perhaps use more ammonium forms? And again, you have to be a little bit careful. You don't want to go overboard. But can we use those forms and perhaps move that? Now, urea, if you're using urea, is neutral as far as the soil pH is concerned. So urea will not sway it one way or the other. And again, this kind of just shows it. This is a dye that's put in when you put ammonium in. This dye shows lower pH around the roots. And then this same dye also, when it goes purple, will show a more alkaline pH, so an increase in pH. Now, what's interesting about this is that we also can perhaps connect this to micronutrient availability. So, in particular, we know that an acidic pH will increase the availability of manganese. And I know we often don't think about manganese. Sometimes we confuse it with magnesium. But manganese can have some very big plant defense responses or implications on plant defense responses. And when we get into acidic soils, we get more availability of manganese. So is it a coincidence? And actually, if anybody is familiar with the film The Maltese Falcon, I kind of call this the manganese falcon. So the Maltese Falcon was this ugly bird statue that no one was aware was very valuable. So it got passed around, and then finally somebody figured it out and tried to find it. That might be the same thing when we're talking about manganese as far as our soil-borne disease control. So manganese is an activator of enzymes in the plant and turns out to be very, very important in plant defense and root defenses. Again, I said it's more available in our lower pH soils. And this is very interesting. So this is work done out of Bruce Clark's lab at Rutgers, looking at take-all patch, and they also have found this with summer patch as well. But basically what's going on here is that, and this is very interesting for a pathologist. It's a great story. Because basically what goes on is the disease, the pathogen, is actually rendering the manganese unavailable by changing its form. So it changes that manganese from a +2 to a +4, and then the root can't get to it. The root can't get to the manganese, and therefore it can't defend itself. So what we can do is we can put ammonium sulfate down to try and lower that pH again. If our pH soils are in the soil is high to begin with, or perhaps we can just put manganese down. So in particular, they found that manganese sulfate at 6.2 kilograms per hectare, which will supply about 2.2 kilograms per hectare of manganese in its pure form without the sulfate, is reducing take-all patch and summer patch, particularly in low manganese soils. So is this something that we can apply to our ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens? Yes? Not that I'm aware of. So the question was, maybe we should save this and my complete answer until we get after lunch, so that I can describe mycorrhizae and all that. Yeah. So the question was mycorrhizae, which is, yeah, let's do that. Yeah, okay. I'll keep it right here. So this is one of my favorite bands. They're called Rush. They're a Canadian band, and I know it from America. But they have this song called The Trees. And a line of the song goes, "The maples want more sunlight, and the oaks ignore their pleas. The oaks are the big trees, and the maples are the short trees." So when you're looking at your golf course, think about what your turf grass is, and realize that grass isn't going to grow very well in the shade, and you're going to have to use more inputs. You're also going to have more water. You're also going to have a lot of bad effects if you have in areas that are like this. So the other aspect in the environment that we need to think about is our thatch layer, particularly when we get to Bermuda grass and we get to some of the species that we're growing here. They have rhizomes, they have stolons, they have a big propensity to produce organic matter and thatch. And basically what goes on is this is where our pathogens hang out. Most of the time they are what we call saprophytes. So they're basically just chewing on organic matter until the plant gets stressed out, and then they go, ooh, the plant up there looks like it's tasty too. So then it starts attacking the plant. The other aspect that's very bad about thatch is that this acts as a big sponge. So all of our pesticides, all of our water gets hung up there, and basically it just holds it there until it renders it unavailable to what is down here where our roots are. So trying to, you might have seen me yesterday, I got really excited when a verticutter or something else was throwing thatch up on the surface. That just makes me happy. I love to see thatch reduction practices. The other aspect behind thatch, and what particularly that fungus that I had there, is that thatch will go hydrophobic. And what happens is that the fungus or another microorganism will be degrading that thatch, and what it does is it leaves behind, basically its excrement, is organic acids. Those organic acids are water repellent and will not let the water go into the soil when you need it. So particularly when we're in our dry season, you do not want this to set up, and you can test for this. So if you have an area that looks like it's just not taking up water, sometimes you'll see it actually run off the top. That's when it's really bad. But basically you can just take a cup cutter, just slice it in half, and then just use an eyedropper and drop water on the surface. If it does not go in after about a minute, then you've got a problem. So things like wetting agents can be applied to try and break that surface tension of the water and get it in, or you might need to aerify or break up that organic matter or that thatch layer. A number of different adverse effects of thatch. You probably know most of these, but like I said, if you just think of it like it's a big sponge that's just holding everything back from getting to your roots, which is what's really important. You don't care about the dead stuff that's between the leaves and the roots. You really want to get to the roots. But it's basically where everything kind of hangs out. Obviously, verticutters can be used. Be a little bit careful with these on Bermuda grass screens when you're not actively growing very quickly, because you can get a little bit too aggressive. But for the most part, you want to try and remove that thatch, and verticutting is one way to do it. And then also core and also solid tine aerification, making sure that you're getting air into the root system and into the soil profile. The reason is those microorganisms that break down the thatch for you when you don't have to just take it out, they also need air. So getting air to them will help to maintain a little bit of those microbes that are breaking down that organic matter. The other aspect is again, when we're talking about some of these pathogens that really require water, you can dry out that soil profile and that root system a little bit more. So there's a number of different advantages to aerification. Also, don't forget consistent top dressing along with that, particularly when we talk about our greens. The reason for that is the most vulnerable part of our plants are the crowns. So you can actually protect those crowns by building the soil up from the bottom. And then you would effectively reduce your mowing height as well. So there's a number of different reasons why you want to stay with consistent top dressing. It makes your golfers happy because you've got a firmer, faster playing surface as well. But from a plant health standpoint, that aspect of top dressing and building from the ground up to protect those crowns can help you actually minimize the amount of diseases that you'll have. So with that, I think it's about break time. I'll answer some questions during the break, but I think I also have a question and answer segment at lunch. So we'll go ahead and take it from there, and then we'll get going. What time is it now?
So it's
10:30.
15-minute break, so it's 10:35 right now.
Okay, so about 10:50 Thai time.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just get started talking, and you guys will just come in whenever. Thank you.